All right. Well, it looks like we've reached a critical mass, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our first workshop this semester in the policy branch of how to write a policy memo. We're very excited to present for you guys today. As a quick intro, Stefan, you can go to the next slide. This workshop is put on by PSPDG, Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group. And we are a group of students here at Penn, a lot of grad students, we have undergrads and postdocs as well, that is broadly focused on teaching scientists how they can have an impact on how science, on how their research, on how the other research is applied in the world. And we do that through three main branches. The first is the policy branch, where we do things like these sorts of workshops, where we meet with legislators, where we write legislation. Then there's the diplomacy branch, where we're working on more international stuff. We have work with the UN, especially the UN Major Group on Youth and Children. And we work a lot with foreign embassies. Right now we have a Philippine embassy working group that's doing some great work. And finally, we have the communication branch. And the communication branch works on generally how scientists can better communicate with with the public, how they can better talk about their research and science in general. And they always have a great workshop series every year on how to communicate science, how to write, how to better present, how to do videos, all this great stuff. So I highly encourage you to check all this stuff out, join the PSPDG listserv. But today, we are part of the policy branch here, and we are presenting the How to Write a Policy Memo Workshop. And this is part of a sort of larger pipeline of policy memo stuff that we've put together last year, and we're trying to do it again this year. So this broader pipeline is bringing you all the way from how to write a policy memo into preparing that memo for meeting with legislators and talking to them about this issue that you care about, some evidence-backed policy. And so we start with this workshop, how to write a policy memo. And then there is the NSPN JSPG memo competition, which sort of this workshop will loosely prepare you for. And that is a competition where you submit a policy memo, you can get it published. It's a nice benchmark, nice deadline for us. And then we'll do a couple more workshops to help prepare for writing for legislative meetings, how to choose which legislators you might want to work with, how to schedule those meetings. And then PSPDG helps everyone schedule those meetings and meet with legislators. And we did this last year. It was a whole lot of fun. We met with a bunch of legislators, some senators and representatives or their staffers from DC, and some from the Pennsylvania Congress as well. And it was a great experience. So broadly, we are hoping that you guys join us for this sort of whole pipeline. But today, we're focusing on the policy writing part, or policy memo writing part of that. So a little bit more on the NSP and JSPG memo competition. So this is a competition put on by the National Science Policy Network and the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And if you win, you get prize money, you get published in the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, which is really cool. And we've had a pretty good track record with this. Last year, we got a team to second place. 2 years ago, we had first place. And we've also had a third memo published in the journal. So the competition is to submit a 3-page policy memo on a topic of your choice. The deadline is early May, so plenty of time. And the focus this year is on intersectional science policy. So we hope that you guys stick around for a minute after the workshop is over to talk more about this memo competition and hopefully join a team to write a memo for that. But right now, we want to just talk about how to write a policy memo, what it is, and yeah, we've got a great program for you guys today, so I hope you guys enjoy it. With that, Stefan, you can go to the next slide. With that, I want to give the people who have actually put this workshop together a chance to introduce themselves before we start the workshop itself. So starting with Stefan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stefan. I'm a second year in the biomedical graduate student school program. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. We're doing full introduction.
Hayden.
Hi, I'm Hayden. I'm a freshman in undergrad studying bio and psych.
Hello, my name is Steven, and I'm a third-year PhD student studying material science.
Hi, I'm Virginia. I am a first-year master's student. I'm getting my master's in science and social policy and public health.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kanika Jain, a fourth-year PhD student in cancer biology, and I'm very excited for you guys to be here today.
Sweet. Okay. Let's get started. If it would, there we go. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? First, let's give you an outline of like what we're planning on, and so you can know what to expect. First is we're going to address the question why scientists should actually write policy memos, kind of help you with your motivation for all of this. And then we'll move on to how you actually do that and what a policy memo looks like. And then next, we'll go into a section about how do you find a topic and how do you find who to target that to when you're writing this memo, who your audience is and how to figure that out. Then we'll go into a breakout room and do an activity. And then we'll have a fourth section about how you do research for a policy memo and how you do that in a group of multiple people. We'll do another breakout after that one. And then lastly, we'll go into how to actually evaluate policy recommendations and figure out what recommendations you want to make. And we'll do a third activity after that one. So with all that, we'll start with the first section, which is why should scientists actually write policy memos? Here are a lot of scientists who are hard at work at the bench, mixing colorful solutions and reading policy memos. But let's give a little bit of background about why you as scientists should actually think about writing policy memos. And so first, we're going to go through a few points of this. And the first one I want to make is that policymakers cover a lot of ground. Therefore, they need help in this. Here is a list of topics or categories of topics that the Law Library of Congress recently wrote reports on. And so they give these reports to legislators at the federal level. And the topics that they have written reports on recently are like just a huge array of topics, all the way from aeronautics and space to religion and the law. And so it's, you can see why we can't expect policymakers to be experts in all of these diverse topics. Additionally, not only are the topics diverse, the policymakers actually go through a lot of legislation and proposed bills and resolutions. And I'm showing some numbers here about the numbers of proposed bills and resolutions from each of the congressional sessions in the past few congressional sessions. Now, these are the 2-year terms that at the federal level they've had. And so just in the last one that finished up earlier this year, they had over 16,000 proposed bills and resolutions. That's a ton of reading that policymakers needed to go through and try and understand. And so if we can have scientists that can say, hey, here's some data or things that you need to focus on and try and help them weed through that and better understand it, that's a great thing. So a second reason why scientists should write policy memos is because we can be advocates for using data. I just talked about how policymakers have a lot to weed through, and sometimes politics can get into lawmaking and things can be very emotional and personal. And so it's always good if we can be there to be a worm in the ear to always say, hey, let's use data to make our laws. And another really big point that I want to make is that scientists, that you all as scientists have very strong skills in research and looking at data, interpreting it, and then presenting it in really good ways. This is your strongest attribute and you need to use it. And what that means when writing a policy memo is that you do not need specific expertise in the topic you're writing about. Your expertise is your ability to research and your ability to present data. So you can use that on any number of topics that you're interested in outside of what you're necessarily doing in lab or in class. And then the last point I want to make about reasons why scientists should write policy memos is because science does not function in a bubble. We are all citizens in communities that have all of these governmental structures around us. We have the federal level of government that has so many people that it governs, and really like all across the country. And so then we also have all the way down to municipal level where we can more closely interact with policymakers that are here in our communities. So at all of these levels, we should feel empowered to work with them and encourage them to make smart policy decisions based on data. Additionally, science and policy need each other. So when people talk about science policy, and if anybody went to the Science Policy 101 workshop last semester, you might have heard some of this or seen this diagram. If you didn't go to that, I recommend going to the PSPDG website and watching that. But science policy can be broken down into two different wings. So there's policy for science. This can dictate how much funding there is for science, or what regulations there are on different types of research we can do. And then there's science for policy. So then this is taking data from research and influencing policy decisions with that research. So we want to consider both ways. Lastly, I think all of this has kind of been a buildup to just saying that there is a ton of research out there. You're all researching different things, and there's so much published data on all of these different things that can go and feed into what our lawmakers' decisions are. One timely example is all of the research and publications that are out there on COVID-19. And there's so many papers, we cannot reasonably expect lawmakers to have weeded through all of this. If you look underneath this line, over 98,000 papers out there. We cannot reasonably expect lawmakers to fully, have time to read all of this, but also fully understand it if they don't understand science or virology. So we need to, as scientists, need to use our skills to do research, interpret that data, and pick out what needs to be said and how we can better make decisions. Now, a step back from all of this, I want to go through a little bit of Civics 101. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but I think it's helpful when we're talking about policy memos to know how our governments are making laws and executing those laws so that we know where we can target our policy memos. And so I'm really going to focus on, out of the three branches of government, these two, the legislative and executive. So in the legislative, there's at the federal level, there's two houses. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so this is where laws are made. They get bills that are basically proposals, and they want to make this a law, and then they go through decision-making process. I'll go over that in a second. And then they get that all written and handed over to the executive branch, which actually carries out the laws. And this is made up of the president, vice president, cabinet, and the agencies that are underneath that branch as well. And so we can target, as scientists writing policy memos, these two branches. Now, how does that actually work? How does a law get made? So really boiling it down into just 5 steps here. The first one is the bill is introduced. This can happen either in the Senate or the House of Representatives. And then once it's introduced in some form, it then goes on to be reviewed in a committee. And then that committee can decide to approve that bill. Now, if that happens, then it goes into debate on the whole floor. And so this has to happen in both houses. So this has to happen in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, where they debate and then vote. And if they both agree, then this bill can go to the president and he can sign it, and they can sign it into law. And so the last step is the executive branch carries out the law via its agencies. And so where in all of this can a memo be directed? Now, if we slap a sticker on it, we can really write our policy memos to any number of these steps. You can convince your representatives to introduce legislation, or to vote yes or support a piece of legislation. You can also even write a policy memo to an agency in the executive branch to help them figure out how to enact and enforce the law. So there are a number of steps in this process, a number of places where your policy memo can be effective. But you as scientists, what does that mean, and what is your role when you're writing a policy memo? What are you actually doing? So there's really three main points you're trying to execute when writing a policy memo. The first one is communicating the data on the problem. The second one is the data on the causes or solutions of that problem. And then for the third step, you want to make policy recommendations, either new ones or ones that may already be existing. So I'm going to go really quickly through an example, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to give you an outline of kind of what you're doing in a policy memo. Here's an example from of a policy memo that some members of PSPDG wrote. And so the first step, they presented the data on the problem. Here they talked about, according to the National Safety Council, the lifetime odds of dying from an opioid overdose are now greater than the odds of dying in a car accident. And then overdose deaths, largely due to illicit opioids, are projected to continue increasing. They say, here's the problem. It's not going away. We need to take action. And they also present this in a very clear and concise figure that we'll talk about in a later section as well. In the second step, they present the data on the causes and solutions. So here, like I said earlier, when policymakers are making decisions, a lot of times these situations can be emotional and personal, and so presenting and looking at the data on issues is really important. So contrary to these fears, there's no evidence that safe consumption facilities increase drug use, addiction rates, crime, car crashes, or drug sales near safe consumption facility sites. So this lays it out, saying that we need to look at the data and make decisions based off of that. And lastly, you want to make your policy recommendations. So in this policy memo, they gave a number of options and said why option number 1 was the best. So their option number 1 was amend the Controlled Substances Act. And then on the right side, they propose what should exactly be amended, and they're very explicit about this. And then they say why it's advantageous and why this is what you should be doing. So we'll talk about how you all can do that with your memos in another section, but that's just the general outline. And so here's one last kind of map of how we're going to go through all this. You're here and as a scientist passionate about a policy topic. Today we're going to kind of guide you through what that looks like into like figuring out a topic and researching that, and then being able to figure out how to write a draft of a policy memo. But then two paths that PSPDG can then help you on is to go down into the route of publishing it in a journal. And then we can also help you take this to legislators by making it making a short version of your memo. It will help you contact the legislative offices and even meet with those offices. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of background on what we're hoping to walk you through today and what you can expect for everything. And here's our next section on how do I approach writing a policy memo. Let's stop sharing.
Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so hi, I'm Hayden again. So now that Stefan told you about why scientists should write policy memos, let's get into how do you approach writing a policy memo and sort of what is a policy memo. So what is a policy memo? The purpose of a policy memo is to persuade the target audience to take the policy actions advised. So there are scientific topics from engineering to public health included in policy memos. So regardless of your interest in policy, you can write memos to your interests. They need to be concise and audience driven. So you want to include only the necessary information. And we'll talk about this later, but you want to write to your audience. So it's different if you're writing towards the legislator versus writing to be published in a general science policy journal. And one way to test the conciseness is with the coffee test. So the way to think about it is if somebody took your policy memo and was trying to understand the main points over a cup of coffee in the morning, by the time they finish their coffee, would they understand at least the gist of your policy memo? And then policy memos help to make an informed decision. So what they really do is they give all the information necessary to understand the problem and why the authors are leaning a certain way in advising a specific solution. And so looking at the graphic on the right, this is sort of an overview of the structure that a policy memo has. So first there's the main point or the takeaway, then there is the background, then there is the evidence, which is usually the largest section of your policy memo, and then you have conclusions and implementation where you sort of explain what the optimal path is and why. So in what context are policy memos used? This sort of parallels what I said on the last slide, but these are just a few titles of actual policy memos I took from online. And just through looking at it for a little bit, you can see it covers topics from infectious disease to drug regulation to diversity in STEM. So really whatever kind of interest you have, even if you feel like, oh, I don't know, I haven't seen a lot of science policy related to this issue, whatever interest you have, you can sort of apply it to science policy. And so now let's dive a little deeper into the structure of a policy memo. So the first section is the header. It depends on the destination, but usually the header will have the title and the authors, and often a lot of other sort of context clues as to what the policy memo will be about, including either who it's going to, as in what kind of legislator, or where it's being published, like a journal. So the header gives you a good first glance as to what the policy memo is going to be about. Next is the main point, which is the action and main takeaway. This is usually called the executive summary, which we'll get into later, but it's usually 5 to 6 sentences where you give a little bit of background on the problem, why we need to take steps to fix it, and then sort of one sentence at the end saying what the steps you believe is best are. Then there is the background, which again is audience specific. So if I'm writing a policy memo on the same topic targeted to persuade a legislator versus being published in a science policy journal versus sent to a different organization for different reasons, your background is going to vary depending on how much you expect them to know. So it can be more or less depending on your audience. Then you have your evidence, which is data, figures, analysis, presentation of alternative options. Again, this is usually the biggest section because everything that you are writing in the policy memo, you want to keep as concise as possible, and you want to base it off of the evidence you have. And one thing that's kind of difficult as scientists that we're going to get into a little bit later is your evidence needs to be clear to your audience. So very scientific figures aren't always the best, but we'll get into that a little later. And then the conclusion, you restate the action, the main point, and summarize. And so the conclusion, you really state which option you're picking, why, and what you think that means. And so just to show you sort of what this looks like for an actual policy memo, because the last one was more so just to show you structure on a one-pager when policy memos are usually between like 3 and 5 pages. Here's an actual policy memo, and there's the title. As you can see, it has the title, where it's being published in the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, and the authors and their backgrounds. Then we have the executive summary. As you can see, it's about a paragraph. They have underlined their last sentence, which shows their recommended policy actions. Then background and evidence, as explained before, is the largest section. And so you go into things like stakeholders, what that actual problem is, the government response, et cetera. And so you alter this depending on where the policy memo is ending up. Then you have your policy options. And so you talk about other possible options as well, not only your recommended one. And finally, you say which of the options you're recommending and conclude the policy memo. So let's talk a little bit about the optimal use of graphics for stylistic reasons. So we have two graphics right here. Anyone can shout it out. Which one do you think would be better for a policy memo?
Bottom one.
Thank you. Yeah, so the bottom one is definitely better for a science policy memo. The top one is something that you'd see sort of in a scientific paper. But if we're looking for someone to be able to look at this and get a lot of information really quickly and easily, if they don't have as strong of a scientific background, this isn't really beneficial. This is sort of hard to understand. Versus the bottom one, the axes and the labeling, it gives a lot of different points in one graphic, and it's very easy for somebody with less of a scientific background to understand. And so you want to make sure that you're providing graphics and figures that have clear labeling and are portraying clear points. So onto a different topic of graphics. So if we look at these two policy memos, this is the first page of each. And the second one is actually a PSPD written policy memo again. But if we look at the graphics, the first thing we see is that the first one on the left takes up about a third of the page versus the second one takes up about a sixth. And so you always want to make sure that you are sort of like optimizing the layout of your page. Not to say that there's not a situation where you can't have a graphic take up a third, but as we'll get into on this slide, if we take a closer look at the graphics, the graphic on the left could be summarized with like 1 or 2 sentences of information. It's not really giving you that many points, versus the graphic on the right is sort of self-explanatory. It has a myriad of different points it's presenting. And if you tried to summarize this in words, it would be at least a paragraph, if not more. And so just to compare again, the one on the left takes up a whole third of a page and tells you very little, versus the one on the right takes up a sixth of a page and tells you a lot. So just make sure when you're employing figures and graphics that you are doing it optimally. You are optimizing your space, taking up as little space as possible without sort of minimizing your graphic to make it hard to read. And you want your graphics to give as many different points related to your memo as possible. And then just some tips. This is an executive summary example. So bluff is very important in writing a policy memo, bottom line up front. So that means that readers tend to read the beginning of essays, the beginning of paragraphs, the beginning of sentences first. It's just they've learned that through eye tracking. So you want to make sure that you you write towards the beginning of your sentence the most important points. And this executive summary too, this is the first paragraph readers are going to read. So you really want to make sure that you hit the important stuff up front. You want to write your entire policy memo in active voice. You want to use optimal use of abbreviations. So if we look at this policy memo, there are a bunch of different abbreviations: PFAS, EPA, PFOA, PFOS, PPT, EPD, GDNR. It becomes super confusing for readers. Even if you do know what the abbreviations mean, even if you had someone with a background in this area, it's been shown that there is a lower level of retention for so many acronyms like that. So you sort of want to optimize the use of acronyms and abbreviations. So obviously people know what EPA are, but things like PFOA and PFOS, when they both fall under PFAS, for example, you could have taken those two out. It was unnecessary when they didn't really use those words that much. And then bolding, underline, italicization, you can really use these to draw readers' attention to certain points of your policy memo. And this is sort of good to highlight what's important and what's not. So here we see executive summary is bolded, presumably the other sort of headers are bolded. and then they underline the last sentence, which is their recommended policy action, which draws the reader's attention. If they read one thing in this paragraph, that is what they're going to read, which is crucial. And then define jargon when used. So you never want to sort of use scientific jargon unless it's absolutely necessary. And if it is absolutely necessary in your memo, you want to make sure that you define it, because you can't assume anyone's background really. And then just a few more clarifiers and tips. You want to explain why the recommended option is optimal. Consider doing nothing as an option. So we look at this option section and recommendations. They consider every single option, which is crucial. A policy memo, there's no point in writing a memo at all if one option is the clear best option. The purpose of a policy memo is to consider a bunch of viable paths and see which is best. And so when you're writing your policy memo, make sure to include sort of all possible options. And then you want to explain why the recommended one is optional. This specific recommendations or action section is a little short. You could expand on it, sort of linking back to the evidence why your recommended option is better. And then you consider doing nothing as an option. So we can see here that option C is doing nothing. It's always important because, again, you don't have to take an option on this problem, and whoever you're sending it to doesn't have to either. And then the last two things are no cheerleading. So again, this just sort of summarizes this, but address all the options. Do not only cheerlead for your one option, don't be biased, and no fluff. So a policy memo, again, should be as concise as possible with including all necessary information. And now we're going to get into choosing a topic and a target. How do I stop share? There we go. Sorry for that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Hayden, for the introduction on the structure of the policy memo. So now I'm gonna go through this brief section on how to pick a topic and a target when you're going through writing a policy memo. And after this section, we'll get into our first activity. And also feel free to write in the chat any questions you might have if along the way. So as you probably have seen before, the crafting the memo involves two processes. So not only do you need to pick your target, so who you're going to address this policy memo to, but you also need to figure out the topic. And these two processes go hand in hand, and it's important to realize that, you know, as you are narrowing down who you want to target this policy memo to, your topic might also be crafted to best suit your target. So involving the what Stefan had went through earlier, when I look through here the legislative and the executive process for how the laws are made, you want to figure out like where the targets are. And so you saw earlier that the targets appear at many different steps of the process. And starting from the introduction of a bill, you can target representatives to get them to say, hey, let's put this bill on the floor. And we want this to go forward. But after that, the committees within this House or the Senate have to review and approve of this bill before it gets voted on the floor. So another target for your policy memo might be toward the committee members to say, hey, let's approve this bill that's already been introduced. When you get to the debate and voting part of the bill, you want to write to your representative saying, hey, you should vote for this bill, or you should vote against this bill, something like that. Let's say the bill does pass through both houses of Congress and the president signs it, right? The executive branch through the White House or federal agencies will carry out this new law that's been made. And so you can write to these agencies and the White House saying, hey, I want this done a certain way, or I want, we should focus on this effort or this other effort. So clearly there are many targets that are available for you to write a policy memo about. But the most important thing about picking the right target is knowing who your audience is. So the most effective policy comes from engaging this dialogue and talking about the issues toward people that have ownership and influence in the issue that you're interested in. And we've been mostly focusing on targets at the federal level, but they also exist at the local level and the state level, depending on the scope of the issue. And some questions to help ask when you go through the target picking process. You want to see what committees might this target be involved in. What does this target know about the topic? What actions has this target taken in the past regarding this topic? And you can see here that two bolded ones here are probably most important. What is at stake? We all know that legislation is a lot of politics, and that unfortunately is a huge part in this whole process. So you have to take that into consideration. You also have to look at the representatives that you might be targeting, or the agencies, and see who do they affect, or who do they care about. For a representative, they care about their constituents. For the agency, they care about everyone. And also, what actionable items can this target take? And these both are absolutely critical to crafting the policy actions that this target can use or act on. Now, talking about the topic, we want to narrow the scope. So there's a lot of, so a topic like climate change is very broad, but there are a lot of things you can advocate in terms of climate change. So 3 questions to help narrow this, narrow the scope. You can ask yourself, what is happening, what is working, and what should be done next? And there are generally 3 types of responses: a descriptive response, an evaluative response, and a prescriptive response. And this will be a little preview of what our activity will be focused on later in this workshop. And so now I'm going to run through an example of how you might go through this procedure, now that you've heard the basics of why picking the right target and picking the right topic might be important. So let's take this idea. We want to reduce meat consumption to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and decrease the harmful effects of climate change as a result. So going back to the 3 questions, you can ask yourself, well, what is happening? So a question you might ask is, oh, how much meat is being consumed? Or how much greenhouse gas is being emitted from transportation and production of meat? These are all valid, like, what is happening questions. Get the idea of, in this scope, in this idea. There clearly are many other questions you can ask. Next, I'm going to highlight and focus on the how much meat is being consumed question and ask what is working. So what efforts have been undertaken to reduce meat consumption and how effective are they? So, looking at legislative efforts or any acts or actions that executive agencies have been taking, and see how effective are they. Do we need new action? Is it already good enough? Those are questions you want to ask. And next, what should be done next? So what policy options could be implemented to reduce the amount of meat consumed? And so through these 3 questions, we have started to narrow down what we want to focus on in terms of reducing meat consumption. So now on that topic of reducing meat consumption, I'll give you an example of how we can find targets. So when you find a target, it might be helpful to look at some recent congressional actions. So this is at the federal level. There are a few acts that were researched briefly. Some of them have already been passed, like this Livestock Mandatory Reporting Act of 1999. There's also some acts that have been introduced on the floor but haven't moved far in the process. And the resources to find all of this information will be shared later in this presentation. So I wouldn't worry too much about all this information, but I'm here to just kind of walk you through the process. So next, you want to see like, oh, who might be the best target to approach these congressional actions if you want to act upon this. And there are committees on the Senate and the House. So in this case, for meat consumption and agriculture, the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and also the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works are all relevant committees. So you can look up the members that belong in each committee and use those as possible targets. The House committees also have some equivalent as well, and those you can look up as well. In terms of federal agencies in the White House, we can look at a report that the U.S. Department of Agriculture put out in 2018. And you can also look more recently at what the Biden administration put out regarding the executive order on tackling climate crisis at home and abroad. So those are all relevant to this issue with reducing meat consumption. And now we go to back to those three questions. And you know, after you do your research, you'll get some answers to those questions, and that will help you narrow down what your possible actions might be. So in this case, a descriptive answer of what is happening. Here, there's this fact that 500 million pounds of meat are being consumed each year in the United States. That's a descriptive answer. Now we focus on an evaluative answer, what is working to reduce that 500 million pounds of meat being consumed each year. There's this reduced meat consumption program that has decreased total meat consumption by 5% over the last 5 years by increasing taxes on meat products. So 5% over the last 5 years might be a good number, but your policy memo might want to focus on increasing that number. And now when we look at prescriptive answers, what should be done next? So there are a bunch of new policies that can be introduced or modified to help reduce meat consumption. So a little bit of a interactive activity here. If you feel like if you want to share in the chat some example policies that could be effective, or you want to say it out loud, please type it in. So what kind of policies might be effective in terms of reducing meat consumption? Okay, so Aaron here wrote increased funding for non-meat alternatives like Impossible Burger. That's a very good suggestion. Taxation on meat products. Okay, increased vegetarian options in schools. That's also a very good prescriptive answer. Impose carbon tax on product delivery, funding for nutrition education. Okay, so these are all good examples, good answers. So what I've listed here, I wrote further increased taxes on meat products, maybe offer tax incentives to farmers to grow crops instead of cattle, and lower prices on alternative meats. So a lot of good answers in the chat. And so a possible action might be focused on offering farmers tax incentives for growing crops instead of raising cattle. So your policy memo would be focused on something like this as a possible action. So when you go through this procedure, when you look at this procedure, here's some. So we'll have a resource document that is accessible to everyone when we go into the breakout rooms. So here for your target search, I have links to the U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, the Pennsylvania General Assembly, which is the congressional body in the state of Pennsylvania, and also the City Council as well for Philadelphia. And there are committees in all of these bodies of Congress, and those you can look up and see which members are part of which. And more specifically for your topic search, it's, there's a lot of brainstorming that people could do, but somewhere to start in terms of general resources, you can look at your lectures, you can look at your readings, your own research is a good starting point. Anything you read in newspapers or magazines also could be a good place. I have a link here for some public resources that link to government reports or some government actions that have been taking place in the last 30, 40 years. That link will be available in the resources document. And in terms of topic search, here's some more specific links that you'll be able to access in terms of finding topics. There's also this legislation records, so you can look at past legislation that's been introduced or passed or debated on the floor. And the Federal Register also keeps good records of legislation and other materials that you might find useful when you go about your topic search. And the last, for some policy ideas, I know policy ideas might not be as trivial as coming up with a topic, so there's this custom search engine that you can use that combine a bunch of think tanks into a database that you can search up, and some congressional reports to read up on while you're looking for some policy suggestions in your policy memo. Okay, so now we're going to start the first activity. So in this activity, we want you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll create a group Google Doc and share in your group. And then you'll, maybe some of you will have in your group have a topic that you're interested in already, or you might select a topic from our list that we provide. And then you ask yourself questions related to the 3 questions about the topic. So what is happening, what is working, and what should be done next? And just keep in mind, like this is just an exercise. So like if you're interested in the policy memo writing competition, the topic that you do for that it doesn't have to be the same as what you do today. This is just an exercise to get a feel for how this process works. And this last slide here, I'll bring it up again. This was kind of back to the idea of reducing meat consumption. This was a little walkthrough of how that worked. So.
Hello guys, how'd it go? Does anyone want to share the topic that they settled on in their group? Anyone can unmute or put it in the chat.
We can go. I guess our group is a little unoriginal in that we've already been working together for some time and already have a topic, but yeah, the Philippine Embassy group. So
what is the topic for everyone?
We are researching and writing a memo to the Philippine Embassy that recommends sustainable and applications to rural agriculture communities through microgrids.
Sounds amazing. Anyone else willing to share the topic that they came up with in their breakout rooms?
Aaron put ours in the chat, but it was environmental and infrastructure impact of de-icing compounds in the northeastern United States.
It's amazingly specific. You guys are great. All right. Well, I think we can move on to Virginia's section here.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Oh wait, I shared the wrong screen. Hold on. Okay. Okay. I'm going to minimize your faces so I can present. Okay, so great. So my section is how to do research for a policy memo. And I'm gonna preemptively say that a lot of this seems very straightforward. I've spent a lot of time doing research in my field, which is in science and social policy. And it took me a really long time to kind of toil with like writing and doing research, especially in groups. And I want to give you guys these tips and tricks so you can be better faster than I was. So I also want you guys to end this section with kind of a template of understanding where your memo is going to go and how it's going to get written in the next few weeks. So we're going to talk about organization. When you're reading research, how much is enough in terms of like when to stop doing background research, how to work with a group, and how to skim and read research quickly. So, okay. So the first thing is organization, which is really important, especially when you're working with a group. You want to be transparent. You want everyone to know what's going on all the time. And you really, especially when you're working with a group and even when you're working alone, it's important to just always be able to explain exactly where you are in your research to someone at any given point in time, to just have good bookkeeping, essentially. So the first thing to do when you're doing research is to kind of like make a list of key phrases. So again, going with the example of meat consumption and climate change, you could make kind of a list of keywords and say like, okay, there's meat consumption, but we could also call that meat processing. We could also call that meat distribution. There's different ways to say the same thing in a search phrase. And the same thing with climate change. We know some people say climate change, some people say global warming, some people say CO2 emissions. Those are all different things that different articles might pop up just because of those small words. And it's important to be able to say that you've done your background research and you're not missing something that's really vital in your background research. So anyway, this is a really good way, especially when working with a group, to compile all these phrases and then under those phrases, write what comes up and what you're reading so that your partner doesn't do the same work that you already did. You'll end up getting through that research a lot faster if you do it in that way. Same thing for search engines, to compile a list of search engines to maximize your findings. Some people like Google Scholar. Some people want to use the Penn libraries. I'm a Penn libraries girl. Some people just do a Google search or want to go through like a more of an academic journal, like depending on what you're researching, JSTOR, Web of Science, whatever. So to do all these things and kind of compile like, these are the phrases I used, this is the search engine I used, or this is the journal that I pulled from, is a really good way to figure that out. And also to note that if you are looking to submit your memo to a specific journal for a competition, it's also a really good strategy to read winning articles from that journal in the past, or articles that got published recently in the past. It kind of can give you some clues of how what kind of structure they might be looking for, what kinds of things are meaningful to this specific journal. Yeah, and you can also use journals kind of as a search engine as well. If you're doing something on environmental policy and you know a journal that's all about environmental policy, that's a good thing to kind of look into and see if someone has done something similar in the past. You can almost use it as like an alternative, like smaller search engine if you want. So moving on. So let's talk about now saturation. So there comes a point when you're doing research where you think, have I done enough? Can I stop reading? Am I reading? Am I not going to find something else? Am I missing something? And that's a really common feeling. Sometimes it can feel like a lot, or that it's hard to feel like maybe there's just too much to read for you. So one good thing to do, if you're unclear if you've read enough articles, is to think about the resources you've already found that are really meaningful and you know are really good for your research, and look at their resources and see if the same names keep popping up in all of your best articles or all of the articles you think are most meaningful. You've probably hit a saturation point where you're not going to learn something new. If all of the articles that have done similar research to you are all citing each other, that's a good clue that you've done enough. And alternatively, if that doesn't happen, then maybe there's something in there that's really important that you did miss that you should read. So it's always a really good way to find additional research, is to look at and see what someone else did. Okay, so again, going with the example of the meatpacking industry and how it affects climate change, just like I said before, you can use the phrase CO2 emissions, you can use the phrase global warming, climate change, the environment, and we all know we're talking about the same thing, but and maybe articles about the same things will pop up, but they're all different words and they might only pop up when you type in those phrases. And the same thing with meat industry, you can say meat processing, meat distribution, or whatever. So what I would do is I would write down, like, this is the phrase that I used, and then under that put a lot of sources. And the same thing with your journals and resources, and just really transcribing exactly how you got these things. So some resources that we talked about as a group that are helpful, these are all search engines: Web of Science, Google Scholar, Penn Libraries, GovTrack is if you're looking for a specific legislation. And then also, I know that before I had typed in like environmental journals, and a bunch of environmental journals I had never heard of popped up, and I'm really interested in the environment. So that's definitely something that I would look into if I was doing this topic. So, okay, so working with a group. Again, this is pretty straightforward, and I shouldn't have to say this, but like the most important thing in a group is to be constructive. Everyone in your group is trying to do their best. They all want to get to the same finish line, and it's important to always affirm and give someone benefit of the doubt in your group. So I don't think I have to say this to everyone, but it's always something that I think is important to reiterate, to be nice and respectful, and above all, be constructive. It's important to give people pointers and to make sure that we're all on the same page, but it's also important to do that in a tactful way. So another thing to think about is planning consistent meetings, and in those meetings having goals and agendas. So in a meeting, you always want to, as a group leader, have a group leader number one, and also think about how to assign tasks and jobs to people. Maybe someone's job in that meeting would be to take notes, so there could be like further organization, and just making sure that if someone missed that meeting, they would know what happened. Yeah, so just making sure that you have goals and agendas in that meeting, and that it's documented. Further, you want, again, to have have an emphasis on organization and bookkeeping, it really does leave people accountable when everyone is aware of what the task is at hand, what the agenda is of that meeting, and to have specific dates and times of when things should be happening. So to have accountability, there has to be bookkeeping, there has to be a lot of communication within the group. So that is something to keep in mind. And lastly, we're going to talk about how to skim and read research. We kind of talked about this a little bit before about how a memo is transposed and like the kind of dissecting what it looks like. So really, when you're reading it, you can think about it in a really similar way, where you want to know exactly what you're looking for, and to have a clear objective of like your target research and what you want to understand from the research you're reading. Further, a publication date is another thing as a reader is really important to think about. So again, when you're talking about data, you should never pull from data that's more than 10 years ago. That being said, if you're reading something that doesn't have data in it and you want to convey to the reader, to your reader, I mean, the framing of your article or some theory that you're thinking about, or say in the beginning, like we're using X framework, then it's okay to use something that's older. But in terms of actual data, it can't be more from 10 years ago to have it be really considered. So again, thinking about the dissection of an article, you want to think about the key sections. The abstract is going to be the section that you can read really quickly and understand if that's going to be something that you should think about and read more closely. And then if you can't figure out if that's meaningful to you from reading the abstract, the next sections I would honestly look at the conclusion first. It'll probably say their recommendation or have another synopsis and maybe worded in a different way than the abstract about what the article is about or the main points. And then if you still don't know, then I would look at the discussion. But again, as we know, the discussion is a little bit longer, so I would read the abstract and the conclusion first. So moving on. So we're gonna go to another activity now. So basically in your groups, you're gonna want to, in this workshop, compile some key phrases that you think are gonna be important or meaningful in your research, and add to those 3 questions with additional information from your research. And if you have time, you can do research within your group or like begin searching and see what pops up, and maybe in that search, you'll think of more key phrases.
Hello, welcome back, folks. Would anyone share their topic and any resources that they found during their brief time of research here?
Sure, I can go. So our group, our topic was, as I think Aaron's put it, was the environmental impact of salt runoff from de-icing roads in the Northeast United States. And one of the sources we found was like this older EPA report of like the environmental impact of de-icing, but we think it could be a good place that highlights some problems that have been discovered earlier, probably in the 80s and 90s, that could be kind of take us down some rabbit holes for further points of research.
Oh, that's really interesting. Anyone else willing to share their topic and any resources that they were able to find? I feel like we haven't heard from any of the AI teams. I would love to hear what you guys are up to, because that's my personal interest.
I guess I can talk. So Asia, Matthew, and I were chatting. This isn't really an area of expertise for any of us, but something that we were kind of interested in are biases algorithmic biases that exist when you're training on these types of data sets and stuff. And so I don't think we 100% accomplished what we were supposed to in our breakout room. So we did sort of hone down on a particular topic. We're interested more in what can we do to improve upon or change the inherent biases that exist in facial recognition algorithms, because we thought that, one, there are probably a lot of domain-specific, method-specific papers that exist in that space, but the applications can range from medical applications. So I feel like I've read a lot of papers in terms of radiology, but then also all the way to like criminal justice. Like ProPublica has written so many articles in terms of how these kinds of algorithms affect the criminal system and reform. And so that's where we stop.
That's amazing. That sounds like a very broad range of resources you guys were able to find already. So that's awesome. All right, I want to pass it to Kanika now for the very last section of our workshop here.
So to carry forward with my section, okay, let's see. So far you heard that in order to draft a policy memo, you first need to pick up your topic of interest and also the target audience to whom you would like to address that policy memo to. Then in the previous section, in the section before mine, you heard from Virginia how to go about conducting relevant research for your topic of interest. But then the question is, how do you actually transition from conducting all this relevant research to actually drafting a policy memo? And for this, there is an important step in between that can really help you bridge this transition. So this is where you need to map out and comprehensively assess all your different policy recommendations. And I will be discussing with you some very popular charts that are often used for people to actually draw this comprehensive analysis of all the different policy recommendations that they've got, which they can then finally put into, pen them down while drafting the policy memo. So the first in line is something called a PEST chart, which allows you to analyze the political, economic, social, and technological factors that affect the feasibility of your policy options. For example, the political factors could include something like a government policies, government term, the current legislature and the future legislation, then the trading policies, international legislation, wars and conflicts, and many more. The economic factors could include state of the home economy, overseas economies, then the ongoing trends with the different economic policies at present, the taxation, any taxation issues pertaining to a specific product or service about which you would like to mention in your policy recommendations, then the exchange rate, market routes and distribution, etc. Social factors can include something like lifestyle trends, media views, consumer attitude towards a particular product, demographic, or any ethical issues that exist around a policy recommendation that you want to involve in your memo. Then technological factors that can affect the feasibility of your recommendation can be something like, can focus on something like the technology which is actually involved in supporting or implementing a particular option, including energy usage and availability of key technology, then research funding, which is available or not, licensing, the IP landscape around the technology, and if the patents are up for getting expired in the coming future or not, and stuff like that. So PEST gives you a starting point to carefully analyze the feasibility of all your recommendation options from different angles. One important thing to note, however, is that there might be times when one or a few of your recommendations would actually not be feasible, especially when as a scientist you're trying to recommend something. Like, for example, when lockdown was implemented to overcome COVID spread, while it certainly wasn't the most feasible option, scientists still recommended it because they knew it would be the most effective one. So what I'm trying to say is that it's okay to share recommendations that might not be the most feasible and yet you think are important to be included in your policy recommendation, in your policy memo, sorry. Okay, so now that you've done your PEST analysis, you can use that to actually map out or put together a feasibility chart. So for this, what you basically do is you come up with all the different policy recommendations that you want to include in your policy memo and put them on the y-axis. So over here, let's take an example of this policy memo that is written to deal with the problem of pesticide usage by farmers. So here are the 5 hypothetical recommendations to this problem, where the first one involves not doing anything, that is just continuing following the status quo, or taxing pesticides, increasing the number of pesticides that are banned, or discouraging pesticides through tax breaks to ecologically appropriate crops, or limiting the number of pesticides used for certain crops. Then on the y-axis, you mention all the different criterias, the feasibility criterias that can have an impact on each of these different policy recommendations that can affect the feasibility of these recommendations. Okay, so then you map out the feasibility of each of these recommendations based on these criterias on this chart. To note, when you actually draft a policy memo, you should discuss both why and why not your recommendations might be feasible. And if you can't go into all the details while writing, it's still good to have them straightened out in your head. So before going forward, if you guys have any questions pertaining to this chart, please feel forward to put it in the chat, or otherwise I'll ask them later on, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so next what you can do is something called a stakeholder chart, and I think this could be super helpful to help understand different policy recommendations from a broader perspective. So you can again go, so for this chart, again on the y-axis, you can put down all the different policy recommendations that you would want to include in your memo, and then on the x-axis, you actually list down all the different interest groups which you think would be affected by your recommendation. Like for this example, it's the public that can get affected by the different the usage of pesticides by the farmers. The traditional farmers, what their take would be, the the companies that are producing these pesticides, the farm labor, environment, or I should the impact on the environment, and the views of the different environmentalists about these policy recommendations, and also the organic farmers, how they feel about these recommendations. And then what you can do is map out how each of these stakeholders would view your policy recommendations. That is, would they be benefited from them, or would they rather discourage them? So this will allow you to take a step back and comprehensively analyze your policies from a broader perspective of different interest groups. It will also allow you to tailor your memo to convince a specific target or audience. For example, let's say if you're writing this memo on pesticide usage by farmers and addressing it to a lawmaker, then the lawmaker is your target audience. And then based on the stakeholder chart that you have put together, the lawmaker would be able to assess how the different interest groups in the constituency would be affected by your policy recommendations. Another important point that I forgot to mention is that it is very important to include this first policy recommendation option, that is not to do anything or to follow the status quo, because this is what will actually form the baseline for all the other policy recommendations that you would be suggesting. So basically what it tells us that if you don't do anything, if you let things go how they are at present, then this is how each of the different interest groups would be affected. And then this gives you an added incentive to actually think about why you would want to suggest other policy recommendations, so that you can actually make a difference, or this is where you start from and this is how you can make a difference, basically. Okay. So yeah, okay. So lastly, what I have is a very commonly used chart, especially in management studies, something called like SWOT analysis. I'm sure most of you might have already heard about it or would be familiar with it. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and can be very useful for critically comparing all your different policy recommendations. So once you're done with your feasibility chart and mapping out how your policy recommendations would affect different interest groups, it would then be helpful to actually thinking about each of these recommendations, and mapping out what are their strengths and their weaknesses, and also what are the different opportunities and threats that they may offer. So you guys can play around with this chart and see when you're actually putting together your policy memo. So yeah, so these are the different tools that I have that I think could be very useful. So with this, we can get into a final activity, which I hope you guys have fun working on. So all of you guys have access to a blank stakeholder chart in the activities document. We would like you guys to get into breakout rooms with your groups and try filling up a stakeholder chart for the policy topic that you have picked up. So try to think broadly about all the different interest groups that might be affected by your policy recommendations, and take a step back and then see, how the whole chart maps out. Hope you guys have fun working on it. I certainly did have fun thinking about this activity for you guys. Thank you so much.
What I can do now is talk a little bit about the next steps that we hope you guys will join us for. So in the resources folder that you guys have been working with for these activities, there is a topic interest plus contact info form. And here is where I'm hoping that anyone who is interested in working on a memo for the NSPN JSPG competition, I'm hoping you guys can write down the topics that you've been talking about today, write down your name and email so that we can coordinate with you further. Now, this is not a hard commitment by any means. This is just sort of expressing your interest in potentially writing a policy memo related to one of these topics. And another thing I wanted to emphasize here is that, from everything that we've talked about today, we've thrown a ton of information at you guys about how to write a policy memo and what this is and all the different ways it can look and all the different ways you can target it differently. But in the end, we are kind of talking about a 3-page paper written by a group of 3 to 5 people. So I want to emphasize that the time commitment, although it seems like a lot, is actually relatively small. And in the real world where people are writing policy memos like for their jobs, or even scientists who are writing policy memos, a lot of times they're turning around the policy memo in like a day or less. They'll be like, okay, can you update like this legislator on a certain topic, and the legislative assistant or whomever will have to research it, write the whole memo in like a few hours. And this is sort of like, we're not professionals here. I don't expect anyone here to be able to crank out a policy memo in 3 hours, but that's all to say that a policy memo is actually not a huge time commitment as much as it might seem that it is. Yeah, and Shannon helpfully shared the document. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that if you found this workshop interesting, if you're interested in being involved with more science policy things or science diplomacy, science communication things, you can go to the PSPDG website and sign up for the listserv there. And then you'll get more information about all the events that we're putting on throughout the rest of the semester. Thank you so much for coming today. We had a great time and we hope you learned a lot.